Hello and welcome to the Game Theory Podcast. I'm your host, Sam Vecini. We are presented by The Athletic. Today on the show, I'm super excited. I've wanted to have Mike Prada on for a long time. Mike joined us over at The Athletic, 6 months ago? Something like that, 8 months
May
ago?
sometime. What month is it? It's October now. Is that what
Yeah,
month
6
it
months
is?
ago. Holy shit, I nailed it.
Wait,
Let's
isn't it
go.
5 months? We got to work
5
on the
months.
math.
God damn it, Mike.
We got to work on the math. I'm sorry.
Oh, man.
Always an editor. What can I say?
Yeah, you are. But Mike is a terrific editor, first and foremost, and I've really enjoyed working with him. But he's also a terrific basketball mind who just wrote a book, Spaced Out, which comes out November 1st. Look at this thing. He's holding it in his hand if you're watching on YouTube. It's Mike Prada. What's going on, buddy?
Good. How are you? Good morning. How are
Yeah,
you?
it's beautiful. It's beautiful 8:18 here in cloudy Melbourne. I'm supposed to be going. We just had a long conversation about cricket before we started recording. I'm supposed to be going to my first ever cricket match tonight, Australia versus England, but I'm a little bit worried that it's going to get rained out, unfortunately. So we'll have to see. It's kind of like baseball where, rainouts happen and,
They
you
don't
got
have
to deal with it.
You don't have retractable domes in cricket?
That's a whole other conversation that people here and in the Indian subcontinent are having a meltdown about, because there's literally a stadium next door that has a roof that they are not moving these games to for some ungodly reason while the country is in the middle of La Nina here in Melbourne. So
okay, that's very odd. Is there like a certain shape of the cricket field that like doesn't work with this?
They're both cricket fields, so cricket fields are not homogeneous. Like it's like baseball fields, kind of, insofar as each one has its own dimensions. The base paths in baseball are the same, the wicket length is the same in cricket, but it's like there's no reason that you couldn't play these games like under the dome at Marvel Stadium, but for whatever reason, they're just not doing it.
Maybe it'll hit the stanchion like that. What that Patriots quarterback's pass supposedly hit, or the ESPN camera. Okay, maybe I'm like screwing this up. Didn't Mac Jones's pass like hit the ESPN like sort of camera? Okay.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
I don't. I'm trying to sound like I know other sports, but I don't know other sports.
You just know basketball. Well, it's good because you wrote a book on basketball, and I'm super excited about it. I have read. It's funny, like you've sent me like a chapter here and a chapter there, and then you told me to read chapter 4 before we had the discussion that we're going to have today. So I've read 25% of the book in different areas, but haven't read like all of the book yet in a single like fashion.
It's kind of hard when it's not out yet,
Yeah.
How would you possibly have been able to do that?
Well, the good news is that I have sources, aka you sending me the book.
Don't out me. Don't out me. Like, is this how we treat our actual sources? Damn.
Oh my. This is gonna be great though. So our goal today, we're gonna talk first about Mike's book and just kind of what the premise of Mike's book is. And then we're gonna dive in and talk a little bit more about just kind of modern roster building is maybe the best way to put it. I kind of threw this idea to Mike, and neither of us really know how to answer the question yet. So we're just going to talk through it as we're talking about it. But my vague idea was basically, what NBA rosters currently best espouse modern basketball principles? Because Mike's book is all about the evolution of basketball over the course of, realistically, like for instance, in chapter 4, you go through history and talk about the evolution of basketball, but specifically it's over the last 5 to 10 years, let's call it, right?
Yeah, I would say about 2014-ish is kind of where we're talking about. But yeah, that one chapter, we're literally talking from James Naismith's gym all the way to now. So, there's a whole lot of stuff in there. But yeah, no, I mean, the premise of the book is essentially that just in the last 8 years, the sport has changed more than it ever has since the shot clock. And I would argue that even maybe more than the shot clock era, although that's a tough argument to make. Imagine you have a court that's this big. I can do this now because I'm on YouTube. I've done this analogy a lot of times at other podcasts. They can't see me. You can actually see me. It's great. Imagine that the court was always this big, the surface area of the court. And then all of a sudden, because people got religion on the 3-point shot, it became this big. But you didn't add more people to fill that space. That essentially happened over 8 years. I mean, you all know, like, sort of what the 3-point attempt rate has done in those 8 years, how it's basically doubled, how it's exploded, how in 2016 the Warriors were like the one team that shot, I forget what the exact stat I had, 35 threes in a game and or per game or 33s per game, and how 5 years later all but one team shot 33s a game. Like, you know that. Now the question is, okay, that's extended the court. How has that changed literally the entire theory of the sport, going from strategy to players to whatever? And so it's actually kind of interesting, this question of like modern basketball principles, because the first thing to probably do is figure out what we mean by modern.
Yeah. I think that the idea of modern, in my mind, is going to be constantly evolving from this point forward, right? Like, you mentioned that within the last 8 years, the game has drastically changed. I think it's going to continue to drastically change, which, maybe in 5 or 10 minutes, we can talk about like how that impacts my job as a draft analyst and almost makes it even more foolhardy to do what I do.
If you care about being right, I suppose, if you just care about like kind of giving people insight, I think it's actually the best time.
Yeah, no, totally. And I'm somewhere in the middle, I think,
okay, fair enough.
Competitive nature.
It's never good to be wrong. And in fact, I kind of hope that what you're saying that's going to change a ton in the next 5 years is somewhat wrong, because part of the premise of the book is that we have had a fundamental change and now we are going to go back to incremental changes. So I hope you're right. I hope that's what it is, because that would undercut what you're saying, would undercut the premise of what I wrote about. So,
well, and it's interesting because I feel like it's like a two-pronged front in terms of the way that basketball has shifted, let's call it, right?
Mm-hmm.
First and foremost, it's almost like the math of the 3-point shot, right? Because for instance, when you play ones and twos in basketball, in the backyard, like, wherever, if you're just playing at a local gym, wherever, you're just getting a run in, right? The 2-point shot is worth 100 times, is worth 2 times what the 1-point shot is. The 3-point shot in the NBA is worth 150% of the 2-point shot, which makes the math in the NBA for teams that can shoot just so much drastically harder to deal with. Even this is why teams like the Lakers, that, I mean, have we seen a worse shooting team in the last 5 or 6 years? Honestly, probably not.
Yeah,
right?
probably not. Well, let's put it this way: a worse shooting team that actually shoots threes.
Yeah, but they have to actually. But I guess that's my point.
Yeah.
The way that the league is now, you have to take those threes, even if you're not a great shooting team. You kind of have to take those threes, because if they're open, they are still just, even if you're going to shoot 30% on them, it still ends up that you're coming out ahead. Or if you're going to shoot 32% on them, you're probably coming out ahead still over the longer haul. Even if, if a team shoots 8 for 30 from 3, or let's say, 9 for 30 from 3, it's still probably going to end up being better for you than taking those 30 shots from the 2-point distance, just because teams are going to be able to crunch down on you. It's going to be way harder to score from 2-point range. And that's where the second part comes in terms of this two-pronged front. It's also the space, which is what you get into in terms of just like, this is the other chapter of your book that I've read, just how difficult it is to guard in space now, and how difficult teams have made it, and how even more than the offensive end of the floor, I think where the revolution is coming in the NBA is on the defensive end of the floor now, trying to figure out that's where the adjustment comes into play now. It's the offensive game. Like, I don't know how much more you can adjust it, and I don't know how much more we can go toward like an equilibrium of threes versus twos. Like, maybe we're not quite there at like perfect efficiency yet for certain teams.
I think we're pretty close.
I think we're pretty close. I
Yeah.
think we're much farther away from that on defense, where we still haven't totally figured out how to defend in space yet, because it's still so novel in a lot of ways across the league, that it is really, it's almost like a changing paradigm, team by team basis, where teams are trying to figure out how to manage it.
Yeah, I mean, there are a few ways to take this convo. I mean, the thing about defense and about space is, I mean, I go back to the very first thing I said. Easier to defend this much space with five guys than this much space. I mean, on a fundamental level, if you double the playing surface, and I think I had like a whole math equation in my intro of
Yeah.
like kind of surface area of the court, like kind of height by width by whatever. Like, if you just sort of say like we're playing our possessions in this much space versus that much space, and you have the same number of players to fill it, it's going to be hard for the same number of players to fill that space. Like that's just reality. And I think we have to adjust a little bit when we talk about defensive innovation. I think we have to sort of adjust to the new normal, which is it's going to be harder to play defense all the time, no matter what
Yes.
strategies exist, no matter what. I mean, and then you add on to the fact that even though we're talking about half court play, which is being extended, and there is an upper limit to, you can't go behind the backcourt line. One of the other things
Right.
that's discussed in this chapter is this what I call this merging of the fast break in the half court set, where now everybody's just playing
Yeah.
faster all the time. And so it essentially is like when you grab a defensive rebound, even if the other team is back, you are essentially running a 90-foot, or was it 94 by 50-foot half court possession.
Yeah.
And
No,
and that's your
you
fast
are.
break. And that's essentially so everybody's playing faster, so that's a paradigm shift, for sure. But I mean, when we talk about sort of like kinda innovation and all of these things, I think we have to kind of go back to just why wasn't if it was all about math, why didn't this
Mhm.
happen sooner, right? That's the question I get a lot, right? If this was all about I mean, I have a quote from Red Holtzman in the book from 1979 that's like, yeah, we if we shoot more threes, it'll open up more space for the big man. Which like, so they knew this. They knew it made sense. The question is why a lot of people ask me like why did it take so long to kind of get to that point? And I think the biggest reason and the biggest thing that the Suns, and I sort of tell this story of the Suns of D'Antoni kind of breaking off into two sects of the same religion, one sect being and them engaging what I call a holy war. The Warriors is one sect and the Rockets is the other. Where the
Yep.
Rockets are very
Yeah.
much like, hey man, three is more than two. Like we just gotta shoot more of these. It's just math. I mean, I'm oversimplifying obviously to a significant degree, but you know, I just when you think about a religion, like it's much more of the science end of the
Yeah. You're,
sun's.
you're distilling it into principles,
Yeah, that's the
basically.
science end. Whereas the Warriors, it's very much the art end of like, and this is the part that I think it explains why the league kind of got it all at once in these last 8 years. Once they realized that the 3 point line wasn't just a 3 point line to make more shots from, but a chaos engine. Like if we make you have to guard out here, you're going to make
Yeah.
it easier to go here. Like all the different ways you could leverage that, and most importantly, and I think this is the biggest kind of thing that's changed, and why I don't think whatever we get in the next 5 years is going to be as significant as what we have just received. You got to take a lot of them for people to honor you.
Yeah.
Like if you got to show that you're willing to pull at any moment, at any time, because everything that was happening in the 20 something years, 30 years before Steph Curry and Steve Kerr met up and they built this blending melting pot offense was, you know, we got the ball inside and then we kicked it out and we were open. But if you like kind of present this, you have to present the threat to profit off it. And I think that's the fundamental change that has made the 3 point line and thus extended the court the way it has over the last 8 years. And I think that change was a lot harder for people to wrap their minds around than three is more than two. So, given that, the only way the court can be extended is if you actually use the parts, you
Yeah.
use the suburbs. You know what I mean? So
No.
I think
Yeah.
that's what's kind of happened. And now to your point, like defenses are starting to try to figure out like how do we guard this much space when like the two most dangerous areas are all the way over here, right by the basket, and all the way out here. at the 3-point line.
Right.
How do we guard? How do we somehow make it so that we are covering both of those areas? That's the fundamental question that defense is trying to answer. And it's going to be, you're right, it's going to be interesting to see how that develops.
I think you're right that the change will not be as fundamental as it
Mhm.
has been over the last 8 years, let's say. Even yeah, probably 8 years, let's say. When did Golden
So,
State go on their Steph and Clay run? That's
so
probably it,
that
right?
that was definitely the big catalyst. I mean, the book tells the story of a lot of events that led to the Warriors and the Rockets rivalry and that sort of whole thing. That's was 2014. I mean, there's a whole section on the Spurs of the year before. There's a lot on the
Yeah.
Suns, obviously. There's stuff on Don Nelson. There's stuff on LeBron and the Heatles. I mean, there's a lot of different things. There's a lot on the illegal defense rule change of 2001. I think that's a major driver of the reshaping of the geometry of the floor. But yeah, the way I would put it is I think it was in 2011 the percentage of shots that were threes was lower than in 2008. It was about the same. So like basically
Yeah,
three
yeah,
point
yeah,
attempts were
yeah.
going like this. They had a little spike for the when they moved the line in 1995, and then it was kind of gradual and leveling off, and then suddenly it just sort of went like, I'm sorry, this is a visual medium, right? I can do this.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I think we're getting
My
it. Yeah.
arm is going way up. So that I would
More
say,
people will listen to this as a podcast, but yeah, no, for sure. Like,
yeah, that's I would say that's like 2014 ish. So, but you could set the boundary at a lot of different places, but that's where I set it.
yeah, and I think you're right to say like 2014-ish. And you mentioned the idea of like trying to defend in space, and that is to me just like the thing that like I think we still haven't figured out. Like we still haven't, like I said, we still haven't hit that boundary yet.
Hmm.
We're not even close to it, I don't
Yeah,
think.
interesting.
Um,
You don't think so?
just in No, I don't, because I think that a lot of this comes back to player development, right? Like a lot of this comes
Right.
back to,
Yeah.
player development in terms of like guys getting these skills down at a younger age is always going to be behind the natural, like
Right.
stylistic adjustments across the league, right? So someone like Miles Turner, who came into the league in 2014,
15.
2015,
Yeah.
if memory
2015.
serves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Miles Turner came up as a big man who could kind of shoot. Texas didn't really know what to do with him, right?
Hmm.
Um, there just wasn't like a lot of there wasn't a lot of coaching from the time that he was young that knew what to do with this 7-footer who was an elite rim protector, who could defend, who had a 7'4" wingspan, who could like struggle to run the floor a little bit at the time, doesn't really have that problem anymore. But like nobody really knew what to do with him from a perimeter sense. And I think that like you see that now in his development,
Hmm.
where he is now like a 33% 3-point shooter, and teams don't really guard him out there, right? Like they don't really care. It's a win for the defense if he shoots a three, I feel like, right?
I would. Yeah. I mean, I think the more important addition to that is that he never really learned how to be a quick decision maker in space.
Also that, yeah, and that's
So
where I was going to go next. Yeah.
yeah, I mean
it,
that's the thing that uh, there was sort of a period, I think, to your point, where a lot of kind of bigs were taught how to shoot, but like it was too late to teach them how to read the whole floor.
right.
And actually, there's also that element of it. And the one guy I think of a lot in this conversation who is actually healthy now, but has obviously dealt with a lot of injuries, because I also think of biomechanics a lot, where guys who we had a great story that is I remember working on with Sirat Sohi and at SB Nation
Yeah.
years ago, and is cited in the book about like kind of all these big men having to kind of get leaner to move in space, and how do they make it so that their legs can hold up their frame.
Right.
Focus on Anthony Davis, who in some ways I think almost is like this. It's so fascinating watching him. I wasn't thinking of him, but this is a guy that like in 2012 was like the future of the game, right? And in 2015 was like, this guy is going to solve every problem. And almost the speed of which the game has evolved almost got it's not like Anthony Davis is
Yeah.
like kind of archaic, but like he's no longer everybody to some degree, if you're a big, has to do some of the things he does. So he's almost like kind of was the generation that got a little skipped over from like kind of
Yeah, like
unicorn to mainstream.
yeah, like I feel like he gets maligned for, oh man, like Anthony Davis like never really developed a jump shot that's consistent except for the bubble where everyone shot better.
Hmm.
Like, oh, it's a weird situation. Anthony Davis is kind of like the exact paradigm of what I'm talking about defensively, where I think that like guys like Anthony Davis are going to be incredibly valuable defensively, but you're right that he got lost offensively. Anthony Davis is like one of the few guys that can really guard in space, can block shots at the rim, can actually cover all of that ground that makes
Sometimes when he's not
uh,
injured,
when he's not hurt. Yeah, of
which
course.
is I think the
Um,
rub in a lot of cases for Anthony Davis too, because
yeah,
the guy I think about a lot with this actually is Kristaps Porzingis. I feel like he's one of
that's
those
the
guys.
guy.
That's the guy
Yes.
where I think he maybe came along 5 years too early because I mean, he was the first player to be called a unicorn,
Yeah.
right? By Kevin Durant, and for a while it was like he was this almost like kind of Anthony Davis has referred to him. I think of those two together because Anthony Davis is often called his like bubble appearance, like he was a Greek god version of himself. I think he's been
Hmm.
quoted like that, and that was what Porzingis was supposed to be as well. Kind of this
Yeah.
like 7'3", like just guy that could go anywhere, could move any at any speeds, move like a guard, play in space, shoot the ball really fast, like kind of this new age big man. And what it's kind of happened amazingly due to one, his body hasn't held up because like I don't think we realize what it took to build a big man to do all those things. And
Well, yeah, and I can kind of jump in from here. So I did an entire thing on Kristaps and his
yeah,
frame when he entered the draft. I talked to like when he was at Sevilla, I talked to the like strength and conditioning trainer who was there, and like they had a full plan in terms of like how to biomechanically add weight to his frame in order to make it so that he would not struggle. I mean, Kristaps was very like people talk about Victor Wembanyama being skinny. Victor Wembanyama is like 230 pounds, 240 pounds, somewhere in that
hmm,
ballpark. Kristaps was like 200 or something like that. It was he was drastically skinnier,
right.
and I think that also in terms of like development, this is why I think that Vic's people are kind of saying that they've done no work on his frame. We're going to let NBA teams do all of the work on his frame.
That's
We
interesting.
we want like we want you to be able to mold him out of clay basically for what you want as opposed to like trying to make it so that he can manage the French league better, right?
It's
So
fascinating, right? Yeah, that's I did
yeah.
not know that. That's about Vic, but yeah, it is. It's kind of crazy that Vic is almost like Kristaps is the Vic cautionary tale in a lot of ways
He
from that
is. I
perspective.
actually think that that's the comp. Like people are making the like Chet comp more often, but like Chet is only 7 foot. Like Chet's super long and he's super skinny, but Chet Chet has a very different body type. Kristaps is almost like the middle ground between Chet and Vic,
Hmm.
almost. As tall as Vic, but like almost as skinny as Chet when Chet was coming up,
Yeah,
or when Kristaps was coming up and when Chet was coming up.
right.
So it's interesting trying to figure out like how do we make these guys be able to stay healthy while the game is changing around them so drastically? What kind of adjustments do we have to make to developing their frame to where it makes sense for them to be able to hold up over the long term?
Right. And I think Kristaps got caught in so much changing so fast
Yeah,
that he started too late in some ways. I mean, you to your point about sort of you talked about Miles Turner and the skill set development happening too late. I think it's in a lot of ways it's the body happening too late for
yeah,
Kristaps and that generation. Whereas Vic is coming into the league where it's more established that this is how big the court is. Whereas when Kristaps comes in the league, the court is literally like kind of widening as it speaks. And so
yeah,
Kristaps is still a good player, but he looks he doesn't look like what he was promised to be. He's a little immobile and slow. So
yeah,
there's that element of it with space, but there's also Something I think is really interesting that's happening. I think there are two things, and this is what I talk about in the chapter that I sent you a while back.
Yeah.
One is I think closeout technique has changed. If we want to get really nerdy about like sort of
Yeah, please, let's do it.
how you close out, like you were for a long time we were governed by this idea that you would chop your feet to close out, uh, and then you would stay in front of your man. You would kind of come out with your hand up the same way, and
Or like jump to your man. Like
straight to your man.
Yeah, like jump into it and go like that. Yeah.
So the goal was sort of like let's keep him in front. But now what you're seeing is that is like just way too slow to cover all this space. Too many choppy steps. I make the comparison in the book where Otto Bolden, who's a track and field star, said something along the lines of to reach your, I'm going to find the exact line. I should probably figure it out. But basically, to reach your maximum speed in a 100-meter dash takes 60 meters. Right. So, like, once you reach your maximum speed, it's really hard to slow down. You do need to chop your feet. But 60 meters corresponds to how, like, that's like more than the whole court. So, why are we like chopping our steps? Like, when players are nowhere near their maximum
I found
speed.
the quote for you. I was just able to hit Control F, so it was a lot easier.
Yeah.
Otto Bolden, the excellent NBC track and field analyst and two-time 100-meter Olympic medalist, once told ESPN that sprinters need anywhere from 30 to 50 meters to reach their top
30
speed.
to 50 meters, yeah.
That means 30 to 50% of a 100-meter race is in an acceleration stage where sprinters are not yet going as fast as they possibly can. That distance translates to anywhere from 100 to 160 feet. The entire basketball court, the whole damn thing, is 94 by 50. More to the point, the space one covers when closing out on a shooter is a tiny fraction of that space. For the sake of argument, let's say a player must cover 20 feet on a closeout. That's a damn long closeout, and it corresponds to 6 meters. The first 100-meter sprinter to reach their top speed in 6 meters will make Usain Bolt look like a tortoise.
Yeah, and it, essentially the point was like if you chop your feet when you're near your maximum speed because you actually need to do that to slow down. But if you're that far away from reaching your maximum speed, like why are you purposely? I think I use it's like a Grand Canyon size abundance of caution.
Yeah.
So now you have a lot of people are being taught you're kind of taking normal steps and you're kind of doing this like horizontal lunge to the side, like kind of almost like jumping as close to the legs into the landing space as possible without hitting them, but then like kind of coming to the side and then putting your arm up. So that's one thing that's happened, which I think has allowed people to cover more of the court, where it's we're not as worried about chopping our feet. I think. Then the other thing that I think has happened that's actually interesting that kind of goes into our question that we can talk about is there's a well chronicled like kind of rise of zone thing happening in the NBA now. But what's really happening, I think, is that man schemes are more collective. No matter whether you're playing drop, trap, switch, there's so much more syncing and recovering and choreography and low man rotation. And I use the example of Toronto and Miami in the book. I wouldn't say necessarily they're the most modern principles now. I'm thinking more like 2 or 3 years ago, where their defenses were like kind of everybody sunk to the nail and almost opened up the shooter because they could then sprint back out. It was almost like they were almost. I compare Miami's defense to like you're breathing into a paper bag and it's going out, in and out, and in and out, and in and out, and it's like kind of more of a 5-man choreography, whether you're playing man or zone. And that was how they beat Giannis in the playoffs a couple of years ago in the bubble. That type of sort of collective, like kind of covering space, disrupting perimeter, like kind of hot zones rather than like always covering your man, how you're kind of the digging down and sort of all that I think has really intensified over the last 3 or 4 years. And I think that may offer one way to cover space is if you're now doing it as kind of, we're not going to let you reach like kind of the nail where you can go one step to the rim.
Yeah.
That might be kind of the platform for some innovation.
Well, and this is where like this is just like so different from the college game as well. It's like almost only NBA basketball or even the international game because there's just so much more ground to cover in the NBA.
Yeah.
These are the best shooters in the world for the most part. There are a lot of really great shooters in EuroLeague, for instance. I think all of them have been snatched up by EuroLeague teams in Europe at this point. There are some good shooters across Europe in general, but for the most part, it's all of the best shooters in the NBA mixed with all of the best athletes in the NBA, combined basically with the greater space of the 23-foot, 9-inch 3-point line, which is just totally different compared to international basketball and college basketball condensing the space. It's why in college basketball, you can see a more traditional pack line scheme actually find success where like guys do sink to the nail regularly and then close out on shooters because frankly, like if you're late on your closeout against a college shooter, you might end up okay at the end of the day as long as you get a late contest, right?
It's less distance too.
It's less distance as well. So like in the NBA, those closeouts just become so much farther. This is why it drives me fucking crazy when people are like, oh, the NBA, no, none of these guys try on defense.
Oh God,
none of them care.
It's so much further from the truth.
It's just fucking impossible to play defense in the NBA right now. That's
right.
The problem.
So I actually love that framing of it because in this chapter, I kind of pose that question from a different way because there's always these complaints. I think this complaint has slowed defensive innovation. This idea that like, oh, what are we supposed to do? We can't touch them. Yeah. And one of the things I say is that when you remove hand checking, what originally happened is that, I mean, this idea that you would have to step and slide, always be low. This militaristic form of defense just got totally exposed because it didn't come with like I make the comparison to football in the book. Do quarterbacks step and slide with their receivers? Of course not.
Yeah,
no,
I mean,
of course
really.
not. You can't.
Like,
you can't. I mean, think about how much space. How are you supposed to cover? Who's the best receiver in football right now? Tyreek Hill,
Jamar Chase, someone like that. Yeah.
Imagine if
Justin Jefferson. Yeah.
Imagine if like you could never cross your feet while covering Justin Jefferson.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you're saying now. Yeah.
Like, so what they do is they cross step, they flip their hips, they turn around. Basketball's become much more of that type of environment by just spreading it out. So once people realize that like stepping and sliding without a hand check all the time was just making you less mobile and frankly more vulnerable to sort of the stuff James Harden was doing where he's kind of surging. So that's like another huge way that defenses started to catch up. But it took a long time for that reason because everyone's like, it's impossible to guard these guys. What if you instead said it was way too easy before and this is what the normal should be? You know what I mean? Like it's the same thing because again, the normal it's about space. It's if you're doubling the space of the court with no more people to fill it, everybody's got to cover more ground. So like, why would you cling to a way of defense that was for this contained of a space when it's not that space anymore? Like in some ways, like the defense was let off the hook for 60 years. That's I think the other way to look at it.
Yeah, honestly, I think that's a great way to frame it. Like, if you have to cover 5 feet of defense guarding Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, it's theoretically a little bit easier to do that. The problem was that Kareem, in his innovation, was that he was incredibly long and 7'2" and had incredible touch. And then, like, nobody was really that big, that long, that athletic to the point where, like, I've talked about this a lot recently because of Vic, and I wonder how Victor Wembanyama would have looked back in the 1960s coming up at UCLA and how Kareem would have looked now if he was asked to come up in this era. And I think I just keep saying this, like college basketball literally banned the dunk for a decade because Kareem was so dominant and they couldn't figure out how to stop him. So like, it's interesting where I think that teams have now gone with this in order to like kind of cover this space and this is where we can transition into the idea of what teams most espouse these modern basketball ideals, right?
Mm-hmm.
They've started to draft like long athletes that they think they can develop into shooters, right? Or
Yeah.
develop into passer playmakers. And the team that, like, to me, clearly is most trying to go down this pathway and trying to like cultivate this grand new project almost of basketball players is Toronto,
Yeah.
right? Like they're almost exclusively outside of Fred VanVleet, who was like an undrafted player and they didn't have to expend a lot of resources on. They just loved him and picked him up. They're almost exclusively selecting, putting resources into players that are hyper long, very laterally athletic, really fluid, can cover ground at an exceedingly high level while also having ball skills, right? Like that is their MO to a T. And they, I think, feel like they can teach guys to shoot. They can't teach length. They can't teach athleticism. They can't teach, like, they can probably teach a little bit of processing ability, but processing
Right.
ability is something that is being developed, right? And I think that what they're hoping to do is to be able to cover the ground of the court. Their innovation, I think what they hope is going to be more defensive than offensive, that their length is going to better allow them to cover the space that you have so eloquently described in your book
Mm-hmm.
a bit more easily and confidently and competently, while still also with someone like Precious Achua, Pascal Siakam rotating over from the weak side, Scotty Barnes rotating over from the weak side, being able to protect the rim with just enough length in there to be able to make it work. So like getting guys that are 6'6" to 6'8" with
Project,
7'2"
what do they call it?
wingspans.
Project 6'9" or Project Vision
Yeah.
6'9" or Project 6'8". I've definitely screwed up that one. Yeah, actually, Toronto is doing something even beyond that. I think I want to blow. I'm going to blow your mind a little bit. They're one of the teams that are thinking in these terms. Memphis is the other one I was harping on last year.
Yeah.
It's not just that It's not just about defense. What they are doing is not just how do we cover open spaces. It's also how do we pin you into narrow spaces with the way they crash the offensive glass, their style of play. What they're attempting to do is like kind of basically like pin you on the baseline. And Memphis too, to some degree. It's a full court strategy because their logic is we can send more people into tighter spaces and force you to send more people into tighter spaces. And if we don't score on the offensive glass, if we don't sort of kind of basically like burrow you down into like this area that you can't use.
I think this fits Memphis really, really well, actually. I think they're even more than Toronto. I think they're the team that fits this because Toronto tries to play up tempo offensively a little bit more often than Memphis does, outside of Ja Morant, just like flying up and down the court, just because Toronto has all these ball handlers that can grab and go, and it's the best way for them to create offense. Memphis particularly, I think, is a great example here.
Yeah, and they call this a possession game, right? Because their logic is if we get an offensive rebound, we're getting more possessions than you. But I think it goes beyond that. I mean, in Toronto, Memphis to some degree, but Toronto as well, they're pinning you in because they know that if for some reason they don't get the offensive glass, they have this flexibility to beat you back down the floor anyway.
Yep.
So, and Memphis in particular as well. I mean, they run sets that really spread you out, but like kind of John Moran is just kind of ramming the basket all the time.
Yeah.
And so that forces you to stay in on him. They crash off that. All their rebounds are small are like not bouncing far away. They're bouncing in. And so what ends up happening is they again pin you in. And the first person that I actually read about this in the book, do you remember those post Carmelo Anthony teams in Denver?
Yeah, like the Ty
George
Lawson, Gallinari, Iguodala was there for a year, like those teams. Yeah.
So George Karl discovered something really fascinating that like he almost took too far, but I think you see this with those teams, Memphis and Toronto, as sort of the spiritual ancestors. He started to place players out of bounds during half court sets, like offensive players.
Mm-hmm.
You know how like you instead of doing like 1-4 flat where like they're all on the baseline, he literally would put those players out of bounds.
Mm-hmm.
Which seems really ridiculous, right? Like, why would you can't do anything out of bounds if you're a player? But what it would do is that the other players would follow, the defenders would follow by osmosis.
Right.
And they would find themselves too far under the basket when Ty Lawson or Aflalo or Gallinari or who else did they have on those teams, those slashers? Wilson Chandler,
Yep.
those types of players would go one on one in this open space. And by the time they beat their first man, the other guys were basically too far underneath the rim to do anything about it. So they literally pinned their opponents in. They got rid of that loophole, the NBA in
Right.
2014. They said you can't put players out of bounds. That's not allowed. But just think about how counterintuitive that is. First of all, by the way, it's like we're improving our chances by like kind of removing players from the court.
Well,
But
think about how much easier it is to play offense in 3-on-3 than it is 5-on-5, right? Just
right,
because there's less space to operate. So it weirdly does actually make a lot of sense,
yeah,
even though it's counterintuitive.
yeah. And now that's very similar to when the Bucks kind of were big on the dunker spot a couple years ago.
Yeah.
With Giannis, it's the same logic. You know, you're too deep to do anything about his drives.
Well,
And
and
I
the
think,
other thing that those Denver teams did is that they drove to the rim. And again, very similarly to what you're saying in terms of shrinking the court, they drafted Kenneth Faried, who's going to
mhm,
come in and just crash the glass constantly. And they made Kenneth Faried
yep,
like a valuable NBA player just by doing that at the end
yeah,
of the day.
absolutely.
Um,
So yeah,
yeah, like it's a real one.
so if you can't, if you ca- if you can't make your opponent play in less of a space offensively, you can make them play in less of a space defensively. I think you're going to see more teams start to do that and kind of consider what I call like a full court strategy of just like almost like if you think about it in soccer, like you're basically trying to keep the keep the defense like pinned in rather than letting them play a high line.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of like that. So that's an innovation that's interesting to me. I'm curious to see
Well,
how that goes in the next
Well,
few
and what
years.
you see with NBA teams particularly is they try to like overload you defensively on one side,
Hmm.
right? And this is exactly what you're saying. They're trying to shrink the court, trying to shrink the space defensively. The problem is that guards have gotten so good now at hitting that cross corner kick out
Hmm.
where it's much harder to overload the side now defensively, because if a guard hits that cross corner kick out to a wing who's like on an empty side of the court and has ball skills, they can just attack, right?
Yeah.
They're in open space, they're in oceans of space. And also, I think this is why you see a ton more sets. And I think that there's an even greater upper boundary for this. A lot more empty side ball screen sets, right? Where
Right.
offensive teams will actually overload the weak side of the court. Then they'll just have like a 1-5 action on the other side and force essentially a help defender to come over from the strong side. Or if you don't, you're screwed, right? Because if you're 1-5 empty with John Morant as the one, there's no one that's staying in front of him, and he's just going baseline and he's going to get a floater, or he's going to go into the middle and get a floater, or he's going to dunk on your head. Like there's just,
It's
you
tough.
have to make those decisions so quickly that the way that that's almost like it's so difficult, I think, for defenses to deal with like these empty side actions. Like those are the ones where I'm just like, oh, this is
Yeah.
almost like curtains, right?
Well, I think the big goal of offenses is how do we set up our empty side? Because if everybody knows you're
Yeah.
trying to go empty side, that's why you swing around and back. You know, the one team, if you're asking to me this question of which NBA roster is best constructed with
Yeah,
modern
let's
principles,
move to that.
I think I
Let's
have
talk
an
about this like fully.
now that I
Yeah.
think I have an answer to this. I think the answer is Boston.
That's my answer as well, for what it's worth.
I think what Boston was doing defensively last year, where they put Rob Williams on the corner shooters instead of the bigs, which meant he essentially could just patrol the back line. What they did with,
And this isn't new, by the way. Like Milwaukee has done this with Giannis. They just did it with a center next to him with Brook. Like
yeah,
the whole thing was that Giannis could run baseline to baseline with his length, his athleticism, be able to just wreak havoc everywhere as a help defender. But Milwaukee did it with a center, and Boston did the Giannis role with its center.
yeah. Also, Boston switched 1 through 4 while
Yeah.
also doing that, and you know Boston's also has a team that's built around guards that can play up, guards,
Yep.
bigs that play down. And then crucially, I think this year with how they added Malcolm Brogdon, they now have like kind of tall playmakers and smaller, just like attackers. where they can just kind of search through that space. But obviously, they don't have Rob Williams, so it kind of throws the whole thing off. But what Boston did to kind of combine those two layers with also kind of we're not taking away our normal help principles. Like I think a lot of teams made the mistake of like, well, we switched, so that's all we have to do. But like actually, you switch and you have to still do all that court shrinking everywhere else.
Right.
To me, that was kind of I mean, that defense last year for Boston was the best defense of the spaced out era, is what I call it. I think they had the lowest defensive rating of
Yeah.
any team in the last 8 years. And obviously they started slow and they didn't do that the whole time. So I think that to me is about as close as it gets, because what you're doing is you're saying our biggest guy doesn't need to be at the rim where you would think to put your biggest guy. He needs to just sort of, we're going to put our biggest guy in the perimeter in different ways. We're not going to start him at the top. I mean, like what Cleveland sometimes does with Evan Mobley at the top of the zone
Yeah.
is interesting. I think like once you sort of get out of the mode of like our tallest guy's got to be by the basket, you can open yourself up to some interesting kind of strategies.
Yeah, and to be honest, that's kind of why I'm like a little bit questionable on the Minnesota ideal, right? With
Me
what they're
too.
doing with
Me too.
Gobert and Towns, because I just worry that they're not going to be able to keep Rudy around the basket enough to be able to make him work in the way that he works in the regular season in the playoffs, while also creating a ton of scramble situations by having teams that will just put 4 perimeter players out there and make Karl Towns run around off ball actions more than on ball actions.
Yeah.
That's what I'm more worried about with Towns, is just like being able to, guard Devin Vassell in space, like what happened against San Antonio.
Yeah,
with
that
them
was
early
that
this
was
season,
ugly.
right?
Yeah, I mean,
So
honestly, I've been thinking for a long time that like as great a defender as Gobert is, like I have been a little. I would love to have seen the Jazz be more aggressive switching him out onto perimeter players.
and that's the thing. I think he can kind of do that.
I think he can, but for whatever reason, like I thought that they should have had him guard Kawhi Leonard in the 2021 playoffs. I mean, that sounds like wild, but like, why put him on like Terrence Mann when you can just move Terrence Mann from the play? Like I would have
Yeah.
put him on Kawhi, and at least then he'd been involved. And I don't know if it's not that he doesn't want to do that, or if he feels like he's best at the rim, or it's hard to reimagine him that way. Or I think in the case of Utah, a lot of it is like, who do we have behind him? Minnesota has less of that problem because, I mean, the other really important player from Minnesota in their future is Jaden McDaniels for this reason. Because, like,
Yes.
if you're going to put somebody out here that's big, you kind of need to have somebody back here who can sort of be a facsimile of that. And he's your best chance. But yeah, no, I'm with you. I was a little, I was a little skeptical of Minnesota coming into the season.
Well, and to go back to Boston real quick, the other thing that I think Minnesota is doing, which is interesting, that they're not really taking a cue off of Boston, but they do have these guys, is having bigger guards, right? You mentioned the fact that they're playing guys like Marcus Smart, Malcolm Brogdon, Derek White, etc. Derek White's a terrific defender. Malcolm Brogdon, good defender, super strong. Like he can get hit by the smaller guards a little bit more often than what I think gets portrayed, maybe. But a good defender nonetheless, conscientious, super strong, very long. And then Marcus Smart, obviously won Defensive Player of the Year last year. Do I think he should have won that? Probably not. But like, he's at least a top 15 defender in the NBA, something like that.
And if he's not, Jason Tatum is rapidly jumping up that
totally
list. I think that's
and
the other.
Jalen's a killer defender as well. Like they can go super, super big. They can go like Jason and Jalen almost at the 1 and 2 if they want now. And then
what
go
is a 1
Horford.
and a 2?
yeah, right, exactly. But then like go Horford and Rob Williams at the 4 and the 5, and then you just figure out like what to put around them. Do you put Smart? Do you put Brogdon? Do you put X, Y, and Z? Right. So,
right.
Yeah.
So the other thing that's interesting about Boston to this point is that you're seeing this without Rob Williams. Like a lot of it really falls apart, though. You kind of need all these elements. Yeah. Like I don't believe their defense has the same bite to start this year. I don't. Where do they rank right now?
And it's weird because like Rob Williams has this random superpower where he is like maybe the best like shot blocker of jump shots I've ever seen, and it's like is like the best jump shot contester. It's why I'm really high on. There's a kid at Dayton, and I'm gonna be there will be something coming on Deron Holmes very soon.
Jerome
There's a kid at
Holmes.
Dayton, Deron Holmes, who has this same superpower of being able to block jump shots, and it's why I'm way higher on him than most other draft evaluators are, because his ability to like contest those jumpers in space is super valuable, while also blocking 2.5 shots a game and like being
Yeah.
able to protect the rim, right? So it's interesting trying to like navigate all of the different ideals, but like Rob Williams is almost, he's like a defensive unicorn, like weirdly, where
Well,
like
that's a funny thing. Like, I wonder if
yeah,
they're going to be more Rob Williamses. The other guy I think of is Mitchell Robinson. If you're in
yeah,
that conversation, but what's interesting is, so I had this like, imagine if you could. There's also the intimidation factor that I think is something to consider. Imagine if you could take like the intimidation of a rim protector and just move that around the court.
yeah,
Like, that's sort of like kind of I that's sort of the ideal. The other thing about Boston, though, and I mean, the other answer I had to this question was Golden State, just because of how much of the court they actually just extensively use. Like, if everybody
yeah,
uses a lot of the court, Golden State still uses more of it. But the other thing about Boston, I think, is you're seeing a lot is just there's this space like kind of around the nail out to the 3-point line, where if you've got guys like Tatum, Brown, these like kind of long perimeter defenders, Herb Jones, Jaden
yeah,
McDaniels, uh, if you're looking at Toronto, maybe like an OG Anunoby,
yeah,
there is like a certain skill, and even guards like, I mean, Van Fleet, this is what he's great at. Derek White, smart. This is like what he's great at. The ability to kind of play those spaces like from the nail extended out, and to be there early, to stunt, to kind of go back, to kind of essentially be like kind of a roadblock, like an intimidating roadblock. I kind of think of like kind of the nail area of like, if you're driving from the top, we're gonna just do everything we can to prevent you from getting through there, and we're gonna
well,
make.
and by the way, I don't think it's an accident that a lot of these guys have consolidated onto the same teams,
Yeah, that's
right?
probably true. Yeah,
Like
I
I
think there's
think
there's no
that,
question about that. Yeah,
yeah, like teams like Boston, Toronto, etc. They're Miami to an extent as well. Miami's a little bit different because they just, try and go out star hunting and then try and figure out the other stuff on the fly. But
yeah,
like it's not an accident that these guys consolidate on the same teams, I don't think.
for sure. I mean, yeah, and then the other piece I was gonna say is that like once you drive and you're kind of in those X out rotations, who can
Yeah.
cover that most ground the largest? I actually look at a team that is not doing this, that I think explains like way more of their shit start than what has been reported, is Philadelphia on
Yeah.
both ends. The game now is what happens the moment you're kind of you've sort of created your advantage, and then you're trying to maximize it with like well-timed cuts and movement. There's a choreography to all of that off-ball movement on both ends, and Philly is still playing with the, I would say, the like kind of Houston 2018 like standing is spacing element, or
Yeah.
we react rather than proact on defense to those spaces. So
Well, they're playing very passive defense. Like you watch Joel Embiid in ball screen coverages right now. Like last year, and I think that part of this is physical because Joel is not healthy. He has the
right.
plantar fasciitis thing. But like last year, he was like not quite at the level of the screen, but maybe just like a step behind the level of the
Hmm.
screen, and was like actually trying to like get into ball handler shit and like was making it more difficult. Right now, you watch Philly and he's way back, maybe
Hands
four
down.
or five, yeah, hands down, 4 or 5 steps
Hmm.
behind the screen in full drop. And it's just way harder to make those rotations in space. Once the guard gets penetration and is able to hit that kick, able to hit that little drop off behind Joel, once he finally has to commit,
Hmm.
it's just hard. It's just really, really hard.
There's that. Yeah, I mean, that's a huge factor. And then I mean, Harden is not proactive off the ball. Maxi is not proactive off the ball. The only guy in their team that like fits the mold of like someone who is just really good at kind of playing and covering what I call sort of from the corner to the slot. The slot's like sort of the big
Yeah,
spot
yeah,
around
yeah.
the arc, so people know the corner of the slot and then slightly in, who's like really good at just sort of constantly shifting in those spaces and cutting through. There's only one guy in their team that does that well, and that's D'Anthony Melton. So whenever he's in the game,
Yeah, I would
They,
say Thibault too, but Thibault's hard to get on the court offensively.
Thibault's good
Yeah,
at it on one end. D'Anthony Melton's good at it on both ends.
right.
So he's the only guy who's like really constantly shifting in those spaces. And you can't win that way anymore. The defenses are too smart. You have to move them and you have to address that movement. Every other good team, Philly's going to win a lot of games, score a lot of points. They have a lot of talent. But the thing that's causing their start that teams are figuring out is that they don't play those spaces very proactively. And so they have no
Yeah,
flow to their game. That's the
yeah.
space that the best new defenses are trying to take away and the best offenses are trying to exploit. There's just this whole choreography that's becoming more and more important in those spaces. So like, I mean, what do you say who's the most modern team? The teams that like kind of are activating those areas on both ends to me is the answer. Like that
And
those are the areas
Golden,
that'll matter.
I'm glad you mentioned Golden State as well, because Golden State's another team that like really just fits this paradigm of constant motion. And this is something that like they're the one team that I feel like weirdly teams have never felt like they can copy. And part of
Well,
it is
I
like
don't think they can because
you
because
can't
it's,
copy Steph, you
you
can't
can't
copy
copy Steph Curry.
Dre.
Yeah, you can't
Yeah.
copy Steph Curry. That's like kind of what it comes down to.
But even stylistically, they haven't really tried to like they tried to copy the switching style with Draymond Green, but offensively, they haven't really tried to like copy much of like the crazy motion principles, right? And it's a bit strange to me that, and look, it's obviously because I think teams feel like we don't have two of the five best shooters of all time. So, what's the point? But I wonder if there is like some of that off ball cutting principle stuff. And like, I guess that, look, Steve Kerr's not reinventing the wheel. He took a lot of these principles from San Antonio, right? Like, it's not like this is brand new stuff, but it does feel like as the league has gotten more spacing conscious, and while you may not have two of the best shooters of all time, you might have three of the top 20 shooters in the
Right.
NBA, and you still have to guard those guys out there. It feels like there's more space for guys off the ball to just be cutting and diving and sitting in the dunker spot and kind of constantly be moving and constantly running actions for guys to get open. And we've seen a little bit more of it, but I feel like, again, to talk about like hitting upper boundaries, it's weird to me that we haven't seen more teams copy that, because Golden State has hit an upper boundary in some level. But like, then you look at Dallas, for instance, and I remember when, Bob Voulgaris left Dallas, like one of the things that he mentioned was like, every time you pass the ball, there is like it's something like a 2% chance of a turnover, right? So if you add up all of those passes over a possession, it's like between 2 and 3%. Then you're increasing your turnover rate to a higher level, which means you, like, again, you look at Golden State, a team that runs this like heavy motion, ball movement offense. They consistently have one of the highest turnover rates in the NBA. It's kind of I get why people do it, and I think it's why Dallas particularly ran such a Luka and continues to run such a
I
Luka
would say
centric
more
offense.
so than ever this year, I would say.
Right.
um, well,
And but
yeah,
like their idea is like limiting turnovers and thus increasing offensive efficiency that way. So there are a lot of different ways to skin the cat, but it's weird to me that like we haven't seen more of like more teams
right.
try and steal what Golden State is doing.
So I actually don't. So what you're talking about is essentially why I structured the book the way I did. Is this holy war between these two sects, Golden State and Houston, and there are descendants
Yeah.
of those teams. I mean, the one of the reasons that Golden State stays on top. I mean, I think the biggest reason is they have Steph Curry. I mean, like
Yeah.
I said, no, I mean, like I know this is like a thing to say, like that is obvious, but I think it's kind of like the 3-point era in general. It's like the
It's
impact.
weirdly not obvious enough.
Yeah, but that's sort of. I mean, the reason he's on the cover of this book is because he very much symbolizes the point that's being made here, which is we've actually underplayed this thing that we can't stop talking about. And I think we
Yeah.
have underplayed the impact of Steph Curry, obviously on and off the court. But I mean, the fact that like someone like that can inspire that level of terror that far from the basket and consistently, constantly prove it over and over again. It's just, I mean, no team is ever going to have like there's nobody who can be like that. I think he's that special. I would say that I think a lot of the league, even as compared to like 2 years ago, I wrote a piece on the newsletter that I cite. I don't remember if I actually cite it specifically in the book or just this idea. I thought the bubble was a really interesting inflection point for this, where you had, especially in that second round, you had the teams that like kind of were higher in cutting. Miami was like kind of playing a lot more like Golden State that year. Denver, very much is kind of like a cut and move and like kind of team. My bad. There was one of the series. Oh yeah, like the Lakers. I think that year were like they beat Houston, who was a very stand around team. The teams that kind of cut in the open spaces beat the teams that stood in the open spaces.
Right.
So in some ways, it was almost like Golden State beat Houston again. Like, I know this is like a vast oversimplification, but I think it's something to think about. And actually, the team that was most affected by this, and I would say the other main character of this book is Milwaukee, where Milwaukee was a stand around team, spread it out. And there was something about the way they lost to Miami that convinced them to change some of their spatial alignments to be a little bit more Golden State-y. And I do think that, like, I mean, you're seeing a lot more 45 cuts than you used to. You're seeing a
That's
lot more
true.
lifts, a lot more drifts. You're seeing a lot more kind of, I think you're seeing more people crashing the paint. You're seeing a lot more duck-ins, more splits. I do think that Golden State is being copied. I just don't think you can get the element that is Steph Curry. So it doesn't look
Yeah.
like it. And so I still think it's very much like kind of, we're still seeing teams that are kind of, Dallas is very much like kind of a Houston disciple
Yeah,
in
same with
terms of
like
style.
Atlanta, which is weird
Atlanta,
because like Atlanta has Travis Schlenk, who built the roster, who was in Golden State during the time of Steph and Clay, and then, you know,
right.
obviously I think it has to do with the fact that Trey doesn't move as well off the ball. That's the other thing with Steph that makes it all work
Yeah.
so well, is like his aggressiveness and willingness to screen and move off ball and just fly around
Yeah.
constantly,
I mean,
right? So like
you can't
you can't
replace,
replicate that even.
you can't replicate that level and that level of sort of energy and just I mean, it's a sort of like kind of like saying like, why aren't there more players like Giannis? It's kind of the same idea. There on some level
Kind of
there's like,
his.
it is kind of the same obsessiveness for things that other people don't have. But I really do think that the league has become more Golden State in particular over the last 3 or 4 years. Like you're seeing. I mean, the other thing that's sort of happening that's interesting is you're seeing more kind of post duck-ins and small on smaller kind of quick duck-ins of the post you throw over the top. I
Yeah.
think you're seeing a lot more offensive rebounding. That was sort of something that I think Golden State was always
Yeah,
relatively
like the
higher on
post
versus
duck-ins with like Sean Livingston and things like that early in
right.
that run. Yeah, you are seeing more of that. That's true.
So I do think the league has copied Golden State. It's just they can't copy the magic part.
Yeah. Yeah, you might be right schematically. Maybe they are copying and they just like looks so drastically different because
They
yeah,
don't.
this is a
They
good
don't
premise of
Steph. They don't
hot take.
Steph.
This is a good premise for a book, Mike.
Hey, that's
But
why.
like the split between Houston and like the Suns, aka Golden State, because by the way, the 7 seconds or less Suns, Steve Kerr was there,
Yeah, but
right?
Mike D'Antoni
So,
was in Houston, so it's like kind of, it's
well,
like
Mike
kind of
D'Antoni's the patron saint of all of this. So
right. So
like,
it's kind of that's why I kind of say it's kind of like I call it a holy war because it was like kind of it's like a two religions sects. They kind of basically think the same thing, but they just argue over what they don't like about each other.
yeah, and
That's kind of
if
the idea.
if Mike D'Antoni's the patron saint, Daryl Morey is the like devil on the shoulder.
I feel like yeah, like who's the Martin Luther of this conversation? Like if we had like
John Nelson.
Catholicism and Protestantism. I'm Jewish, so I can say these things. But yeah, and that's sort of the way, and it's like that rivalry pushed the whole league forward because
Yeah, it did.
to them they were just like kind of bashing their heads against each other. It was kind of like a Cold War too, because like they didn't drastically fight, but like there was a lot of like underhanded like. Do you remember that? I cite this in the book, that panel that Bob Myers did after the 27 threes at Sloan, where it was like take the rock, take our opponents for example. You're down 20, you need a three, like step back three, okay, but sometimes you just need to score. Do you remember this panel?
Yeah. Yeah.
There was
I
a
don't
lot of
remember the
like,
exact. I remember the quote vaguely. Yeah.
yeah, there's a lot of like Cold War stuff and like kind of going on. But I think that their rivalry.
Where does light years fit into the Cold War?
And but I really do.
Where does Samus Andy and Andy Liu fit into the Cold War?
Let's see. They're God. Who's like yeah, I don't know religious history off
Do
the
you
top of
read
my
the
head well
Game of
enough.
Thrones? Have you read it, Fire and Blood in the Game of Thrones book?
I have never
Uh,
watched Game of Thrones. I will not
oh
lie.
God,
I have
yeah.
not.
For people,
I am into Lord of the Rings and I am into Star Wars, so I'm into other mythologies.
yeah, I know you are. That's why I was like, are you into Game of Thrones at all?
Nope.
Andy and Sam are the blood and cheese for people who or don't look that up necessarily if you don't want to know where House of the Dragon is going next year. But yeah,
Ooh.
that's where this is going.
I, I
Um,
I hesitate to call them what the who are the two Hamlet or Shakespeare heroes, Rosencrantz and Guilderson or
Guildenstern. Yeah,
Guildenstern.
yeah.
They're having me on their podcast. I shouldn't say these things about them.
I love them. They're the
They're
best.
great,
I love
but
what they're doing so much.
for real, that is very much like kind of the premise of the book is that this is the rivalry that pushed the whole league forward, and you could write a whole book about that rivalry, but I didn't. Wrote it a little bit more grander, but I think that like in some ways the Rockets are just as significant to the development of basketball as the Warriors, even though the Warriors won on the scoreboard.
I think that's right. I absolutely agree with that. Like, couldn't agree with that more. Those Rockets teams are going to come back and it's the same. They're the antecedent or like the direct descendant of the 7 seconds or less Suns to me. Looking back, because they're the team that pushed the league forward without winning a title at the end of the day.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, and just like there's a lot of talking about Don Nelson in there as kind of the positional. I mean, I have a whole thing about positionalists. I kind of hate that term. Uh, like just there,
There's
sometimes you
no
can.
such thing as positionless. Yeah, I don't
I hate that
like. I
term
think
so much.
positions are a thing. Yeah, especially on
Yeah,
defense.
yeah. I mean, yeah. You have to read that chapter,
Please
listeners.
go read Mike's book. That's the caveat.
um, but yeah, no, just like kind of sometimes you study the people that are most willing to just push the limits like too far are the ones that are the best to learn about innovation. You know, Don
Yeah.
Nelson was the same way. You know, he's now revered in a lot of ways. When in his time, people were like, "Who the fuck is this guy?"
Well, and there's a difference sometimes between like innovation and success in a lot of ways. And
Hmm.
like everyone then correlates it to, oh, this person was ahead of their time, or they were, they came too early, right? Well, sometimes like it's not that they came too early, it's that they took it too far and
Right.
they weren't going to win the title at the end of the day. Like Houston, um, probably went a little bit too aggressively in one direction and didn't win because of it, even if they pushed basketball forward, which arguably to me, as someone who just loves the sport and loves the game, I care about that even. I'm sure Daryl Morey does not think this, but
Yeah.
like I care about that more than a title a little bit. Like to me,
Well,
I think it's
D'Antoni
more
has said
important.
that, hasn't he? Like in some ways,
Yeah.
like he's more significant. Yeah, I mean, and just I mean, we didn't even get into like kind of the way James Harden's. You know, everybody does that double step back now that James Harden does.
Yeah.
Like all of a
Yeah.
sudden, that was like everybody mastered that footwork,
Yeah.
and that was just
It's him and Damian Lillard. That's it.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was a hack, and everybody got it. I mean, that is literally there's a whole chapter about that, about
Yep.
just the way people move, and you know, there's a Allen Iverson is a prominent figure in that chapter. Allen
Yeah.
Iverson never won a title.
It's so interesting. Damian Lillard also is like, has not yet won a title. Like, and he's
Oh,
someone that like kind of pushed this. Yeah.
well, the Blazers are 4-1, aren't they?
Yeah. Here it comes, baby. Mike, do you have anything else you want to get off your chest before we go here?
I don't think so. It's still available for pre-order. It's coming out November 1st. I guess the only thing I'd say is I'm sure this doesn't apply to most of your listeners, but if you're a skeptic about how the game has changed, if you kind of are a back in my day type of person, I actually think this book is very much tailored to you.
Yeah, I can echo that. Like, look, the 25% of this book that I've read, I can say that this is not like a, analytics first book that's, gonna frustrate the old heads and like all that stuff. It really does a good job of simplifying concepts that are complicated and that really explain why the league is going where it is and why it's not going to change anytime soon, right? Like I think that that's the best compliment I can give you is you've written an incredibly readable book that distills complicated concepts that are modern in nature into eminently readable ideals, basically.
I appreciate that. That was definitely the goal. I mean, I joke I have an uncle who's a big Celtics fan, but is very much a back in my day type of
Yeah.
thinker. And I would joke to him. I said, I'm basically thinking of you every time I write a sentence."
Yeah.
Um,
I think that's the absolute best way. Like seriously, it's how like I do that now when I write.
right?
Like I'm just like
Yeah,
I want like the most like I'm gonna write some advanced number stuff, like, but I think that it's you don't want to write above your audience just because you want to look
yeah.
smart, right?
Well, I mean,
Like,
and the truth is, it really isn't that complicated. I mean, we
yeah, it's not.
overcomplicate some of this
It's not
stuff.
rocket science.
Right. um, the other thing I'll say is I mentioned you've probably seen this on Twitter with some of the giveaways, but instead of having clipboard graphics or X's and O's, what I've done is I sort of recreated the spatial alignments of I think 32 different plays in
It's
NBA
amazing.
history, just to kind of give you a sense of just how the court has how the alignments have changed. So I hope that those are really cool companions. Maybe almost it's I didn't want to do like I didn't want to do like kind of abstract X's and O's. I wanted to do something where it was like you've seen this moment, like now see it in a
Yeah.
different way. So hopefully that lands as well. And again, 6 of you have won free books out of guessing which plays I'm talking about. So you have to see what some of the other ones are.
I think it's brilliant. I think it's super, super smart to do it that way because it really does emphasize just how tight we were in 1970 versus how spaced out everything is. And oh, by the way, the name of Mike's book is Spaced
Great, good
Out.
job.
Please go buy this book, go pre-order it, go support Mike. He's a really sharp guy, as you can see by this show. This has been the Game Theory Podcast. My stuff for this week: I had a mock draft go live today. Please go read that. I had positional rankings go live last week. Please go read those. And then coming next week, I have the start of a really fun project that I'm excited about. It's kind of a combo podcast and written kind of story ideal. You guys will see it when it comes. The first one, I think.
It's very cool. As someone who
Yeah, it's either going to come out Sunday or Tuesday. I can't remember which one. And then the written will come out Monday and Wednesday.
Let me go check.
So,
Let me go check our calendar.
yeah,
I'm just
I was going
kidding.
to say I put in like, hey, like I got done with the first few of them. I put it into my
Yeah,
channel a couple days ago, and I was like, yeah,
yeah.
like got done with the first few of these. We should do it. Like when do you want these? Because I'm going to file the first one today.
That's right, guys. Sam has his own channel in our Slack room.
Well, I write like 50,000 words every month, so it's
Also,
an editorial lift.
it's also you're like kind of on like the opposite schedule of us. So, but
That's
it is still funny. Like the day I got invited into your secret channel was one of my favorite days as an athletic.
You're just like, what is happening
I
here?
was like, "Woo, I'm in!" Very cool because not every editor is in this channel. I'm gonna be honest.
Yeah, I think that people have jumped in and out as they've moved to different jobs. Like I think Bobby Clay used to be involved, but Bobby
Well,
is
he's still at the Athletic.
still at the Athletic, just has moved to a different role. Khalid was there for a while. He's not at the company anymore and has moved on to bigger, for him, hopefully better things. Like, yeah, we bounce around, but the channel is here to stay because I am here to stay at the Athletic. So it's very enjoyable. Mike, tell the people where they can find you online so they can get some of these giveaways and excited about things.
Unfortunately, the giveaways are over, at least until the book is released. But you can follow me on Twitter, Mike Prada MBA. It is spelled like the Italian handbag company and the Anne Hathaway movie, but not pronounced that way. It was Anne Hathaway in that movie, right?
Yeah, nailed it.
Yeah. Okay, I got it right. But yeah, you can find me there. You can order the book really anywhere you get books. You can do it on Amazon, on Barnes and Noble, on whatever. If you had a choice, I would say order it through bookshop.org to support your local bookstore, but that doesn't do anything for me one way or the other. It's just, I think, a nice thing to do. You can order from the publisher. There are a couple excerpts out now on The Athletic and on SB Nation. There may be one or two others. We'll see. Stay tuned. I may have to go work on that. But yeah, it's just, hopefully you enjoy the book. And like I said, I think it's for basketball fans of all types. Like, it's not, I really very much try not to make it a dense, as I try to do all the time, but just a lot of people think it's about threes. It's really not about threes. It's about the court. It's about the space that was resulted from the threes. So thank you so much for having me on.
This has been great, Mike. This has been the Game Theory Podcast. Please remember, rate, review, subscribe. Go to the YouTube channel, Game Theory Podcast with Sam Vicini, and subscribe there as well. We'll be back next week with Adam Spinella to talk prospects. We're going to do a vibe check across the NBA as well. How are the vibes across the league?
Lakers bad, Sixers bad,
Lakers bad, Philly bad. Things bad there. But there
Wizards surprisingly not bad.
Yeah, your beautiful Washington Wizards. They're actually kind of fun. Shout out Kyle Kuzma, who's been really enjoyable. One of my most prized, enjoyable watches thus far this year.
Modern
Kyle Kuzma.
He arrived mid-prime from the Lakers, kind of like Caron Butler once arrived mid-prime from the Lakers. There are a lot of parallels there.
I love it. That's great. Please rate, review, subscribe. We'll be back next week with more. Until next time, we'll talk soon.